So video relay service, or VRS, means, and maybe you have seen technologies like Skype, FaceTime, Uvu, those types of technologies that are out there that allow people to have a face-to-face conversation with other people. You probably are familiar with those technologies. VRS is a similar concept that's used within the deaf community, but it is used primarily for phone calls, for a person calling another person. So as a deaf person, I can call another deaf friend or deaf family member or coworker through a video phone, and that's the name of the device, the technology. It's essentially a webcam. That's the concept, that people will use a video phone perhaps through their computer or through their smartphone, through an iPad or other device, and they may have hardware that is connected to a TV monitor, perhaps with a built-in camera, where a person can see another, deaf colleague, for example, and my face is visible on the screen and their face is visible on the screen. We're able to sign directly to each other, essentially face-to-face. If I, as a deaf person, however, wanted to contact one of you who's hearing, perhaps as a provider, to seek technical assistance, I would simply dial your phone number into the VRS system, whether it's on a special remote that's connected to the hardware or into the computer system that's using video relay service, and I'll be connected automatically to what's called a video relay service interpreter, or VRS interpreter. And that interpreter will pop up on the screen that I'm looking at and say, hello, this is interpreter number 234 at whatever provider, and I'm going to connect your call. And I will say, please do. The interpreter will then dial your number for me, connect, let me know that the phone is ringing. They may tell me how many times it's ringing until you answer, and then the interpreter will proceed to sign everything that you say, and I will sign back, whatever I'm looking for, and the interpreter will voice that to you. You'll speak directly through the interpreter to the deaf person, and vice versa. And you see a picture here on the screen that's showing what a typical VRS conversation looks like, and how that conversation is cycled. It's very simple. As the hearing person, if you have a deaf client that you have ongoing interactions with, and you need to contact them, you're certainly able to. It's not a complicated system. You don't need to pay anything additional. You don't need to set up any additional equipment. You just need to have their video phone number, and when you call that number using your cell phone or a landline or what have you, you automatically will connect to the video relay service interpreter, who you'll be hearing. You'll be hearing the interpreter's voice on your headset. And if the deaf person's not there, you can even leave a message to the interpreter. The message will be signed and then video recorded, and the deaf person will be able to receive that message on their video phone, or occasionally they'll receive an email that has a link, an attachment that they can open, and then see your message interpreted into American Sign Language. This has been an amazing technology that's developed, both the video phone technology and video relay service. It almost has, at this point, entirely replaced TTY technology. A lot of hearing people are familiar with TTY technology, but TTYs have become very outdated technology and fairly obsolete, with the exception of some deaf people who use them, particularly senior citizens who prefer to use TTYs. Other than that, TTYs have largely gone out of use. TTYs look like a typewriter that's used in conjunction with a landline phone, and it uses a person's typed message, a typed English message, that will go through a communication assistant that's similar to a VRS interpreter. However, the process is slow and cumbersome. And for a number of deaf people, English is not our first language, and ASL is our first language, which means typing on the TTY equipment can really affect communication, because when a person communicates through writing, it may look grammatically like broken English because they're writing what makes sense to them in grammatical ASL. It makes sense if they were to sign what's written to a deaf person, but it won't make sense to a hearing person, who's expecting grammatically correct spoken English. So a good number of misunderstandings and a lot of struggle can take place through TTY communication. However, video phones and VRS has really made a big impact on the deaf community and our ability to access services. One example of how what you may expect when a deaf person calls you is this type of VRS call. And there's another example then that I'll show you on the next slide. There also is what's called IP relay. In Colorado, some people refer to this as Colorado Relay. It refers to the same thing. It is also a text-based relay service, and instead of a screen with a webcam device or a monitor with a webcam device, if I'm the deaf person, perhaps I don't have high-speed internet that's fast enough to use VRS, or maybe I'm not comfortable using ASL. Maybe I'm not comfortable looking at the interpreter, and I don't want the interpreter to see me. There are lots of different reasons why people may prefer to use text-based relay to video relay, but it functions very similarly in terms of VRS. So if I were to use IP relay and I got onto the app on my phone or on my computer, I would connect and say I needed to call one of you again. I would type onto the keyboard or onto my phone and connect to an operator, and the operator will then call you for me, and say, hi, this is Avi, I'm calling from Dove, and that's what you'll hear through the interpreter. And when you speak back, the interpreter will type that message back to me, which will be displayed on my monitor, and then I can respond with my response that's typed. It's very similar to what I mentioned before, which is TTY technology and TTY relay, traditional relay. And sometimes communication can be very slow or cumbersome or confusing, in fact. But again, some deaf and hard of hearing people will prefer, and they're more comfortable to use text-based relay and that approach to their phone calls. On the next slide, oh, there we go, sorry. There's another technology called VCO, or voice carryover. And most people who use VCO are hard of hearing, or they're deaf individuals who feel comfortable or adept with spoken English, with using spoken English. And they may prefer to use their own voice rather than typing, or rather than using an ASL interpreter through the video relay service, as I mentioned. And how that works is very interesting. A VCO user will place the call and will connect with an interpreter, and the voice that you'll hear will be the deaf or hard of hearing person. However, there is still an operator in the midst of the conversation typing what you say back. It's almost like live captioning. And the deaf person will then see that on the screen, those captions coming through about what you are saying back to the deaf or hard of hearing person. So, and it really functions similarly to closed captioning that you've seen on TV, that type of concept. But it allows the deaf or hard of hearing person to use their own voice if they would prefer that. So that's another option that's utilized. And again, there may be some lag time that's experienced because the operator is busily trying to keep up with the person who's speaking, and then the deaf person is trying to keep up with what they're reading on the screen. So that can result in some lag time as well. So when you have a VRS call, so some tips to keep in mind are oftentimes, and this is very normal, I think it's intuitive and very natural, but many hearing people will, when they have a hearing, or I'm sorry, when they have an interpreter, on-site interpreter in a situation versus an interpreter through the phone conversation, they'll say, tell her, or ask him, that kind of thing, and say things in the third person. And in fact, you don't need to do that, or you should try to avoid that. Just speak directly to the deaf caller, or to the deaf client who's in your office. Speak directly to them. How are you doing today? What can I do to help you? What's going on with you? Speak directly to them in the first person, and try to avoid thinking of, in fact, the interpreter is playing an important role and they're present in the setting, but they're not involved in any way in the situation. They don't know anything about what's going on. The deaf caller knows what's going on, and it's important to recall that you're speaking to the deaf person, not to the interpreter, and to essentially forget that the interpreter is there. The interpreter is responsible to, inform you if they need you to slow down, or if there's a misunderstanding, if they didn't catch what you said. They're trained professionals, and they'll interject and say, I'm sorry, this is the interpreter speaking now, and they'll make that clear. I didn't catch that last word that you said. Do you mind repeating that for the interpreter? They will certainly seek that assistance if needed. And as I mentioned, you can expect, again, some lag time with all three types of phone calls, because the fact is there is a third party involved in that conversation that's relaying that conversation back and forth between two people. However, you don't have to speak slowly like this at all. In fact, there's no need to do that. You can speak at a normal pace, and again, the interpreter will interject if you're speaking too quickly. So remember, when you receive a call from someone who's hard of hearing, they may call using a cell phone or a landline and not use any of these technologies that I just mentioned. And that can be a rather difficult situation, obviously, because they may not identify themselves and say, hi, I'm hard of hearing. I just experienced sexual assault or something. They wouldn't say that as their introduction. They'll just jump into the conversation, right? And so you will have to figure out using, their cues that they may be missing quite a bit of what you're saying, or asking you to repeat a number of things that you're saying, that their responses don't maybe match your questions. That then are some clues that the person may have some type of hearing loss. And it's okay to ask, in a respectful way. Say, I'm not sure if you're able to hear me. Do you need me to speak more loudly, or do you need me to speak more slowly? And that's a good way to ask without, making it all about their, disability per se. And then they will respond with their preference. And also, when you receive a call, say from a relay operator, whether it's a video relay service operator or a VCO call, you will hear, some type of, greeting, like, hi. The person calling you is using sign language to communicate. They're calling through, let's say, Sorensen video relay service, and I'm interpreter number, blah, 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 whatever it is, and I'm going to now connect your call. And in the past, I think I'm seeing this less and less now, but it certainly hasn't alleviated entirely. But when people receive that type of greeting, they would hang up immediately, because they would think that it was a telemarketing call. They would think it was somebody advertising something, which was a real frustration for deaf people, especially when it came to deaf people who were in crisis, seeking help, reaching out to law enforcement or to hospital personnel or crisis responder. And the interpreter would announce that it was a relay call, and the deaf person would be hung up on. So it's important for you and your organization to be aware that when you receive that type of message, know that it's not a telemarketer, and to stay on the line and just to allow the call to continue. You will hear different variations of that greeting, as I mentioned, that message. Sorensen is the name of one of the video relay service providers, and there are a number of providers out there throughout the United States. So the interpreter who's working in the call center, relaying your phone call conversation with the deaf person, oftentimes is not from Colorado. They're in a call center from somewhere in the United States. Could be anywhere in the United States. And occasionally, especially in crisis, the deaf person will start to sign very rapidly to the VRS interpreter, and they'll use what we refer to as sign names. For example, a place like Denver, the city, we refer to with a name sign. Colorado Springs, the person will just say CS, CS, or Denver, they'll just shake a D in the air. And the interpreter, who's not from Colorado, may be unfamiliar with those name signs. And so it may result in some need, some frustration, and the interpreter is missing something. You may feel a bit lost about what they're talking about initially. You can always ask the deaf person to repeat, or say, I'm not clear about where exactly you said something happened. Do you mind repeating that? And sometimes the interpreter will step out of their role and say, when you shake that D in the air, what city is that? And the deaf person will go, oh, right, you're not from here. And they'll spell Denver out so that the interpreter becomes familiar with that name sign. So just be aware that that occasionally will be a frustrating issue in that moment, because the interpreter most likely is not from the state of Colorado and may not know some of the local signs for cities and places. ASL is a language that's used throughout the United States, but people often do have regional variations, regional signs, just like spoken language. There's dialects and accents to spoken language. The same goes with American Sign Language. Some signs are a local variety that aren't used in other places, other states. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. I wanted to go into some cultural notes and cover some of those as well with you. People who identify as part of the deaf culture and community, keep in mind that they're very collectivist. They're a very collectivist culture, as opposed to individualistic. They don't tend to follow Western type of thinking, in terms of coworkers, families, the community being involved. They think it's important to get people involved in the phone conversation type of thing. And I probably shouldn't be using the phone as an example, but the deaf person may call someone over, call their mom over to sit with them while they're signing. And so that's another thing that can overwhelm the interpreter, because most of the time the interpreter is probably used to that, and they may have to say to the hearing person, okay, now someone else is signing. And the hearing person who doesn't see that someone else is there may say, well, who is signing out? I hear the same voice. And you have to remind them to make clear, to say, oh, I'm this person's mom, or I'm this person's sister, and remind them to explain who's on the call. Because, in crisis, they may not be thinking to introduce who is speaking, because the deaf culture is so collectivist. They may also seem to go on and on and on about what took place. They may give you every detail in the book, the backstory about what happened that led up to this particular incident, or what happened afterwards in great detail. The person was there, and I was mad, I was so upset, for example. And that is just a part of the deaf culture. Storytelling is an important value. Oftentimes deaf people lack access to information in quote-unquote the hearing world, and so we always feel like it's critical for people to understand, everything, 100% of the details of what took place. We think that's very important, and so that may be something that you think of as yourself. Well, I don't need to know all of this information, who thinks this way and who thinks that way and who was there before and who is there after. But if you can bear that in mind and be patient and listen to those details, because it's important for the deaf person, survivor, to be able to, explain everything that happened, even though you may feel all of the details aren't relevant. As I mentioned before, and I'll repeat again, it's worth mentioning again, most deaf people don't consider English as their first language. And it really is significant in terms of how deaf people may fill out, let's say if they come into your office and fill out an intake form or a screening type of form with you. And, you may not have an interpreter there involved at that moment. They're filling out forms, and they may not exactly understand what that form is asking for. And the answers on their forms may not suit what the form is asking for, and that's because English is not their, for most deaf people, it's not their first or primary language. So you may want to, at that point, rephrase a question, use gestures even, use pictures, and it really depends upon the deaf person's preference. And they certainly will say or let you know if they don't understand, or if they seem to be going along on the form fine, but when you look at it, you don't understand what they're writing, then of course you'll have to work with the deaf survivor to make sure that both of you are understanding each other clearly. And again, as I mentioned before, the lack of access to information and education, it just has a huge impact on the deaf community. Oftentimes deaf children grow up in hearing families, and unfortunately, because as I mentioned before, when it comes to the medical view of disability and deafness, that has a large impact on medical providers who typically will tell parents, when a deaf baby is born to a hearing family, don't use sign language with them. Avoid using sign language. Focus all of your efforts on audio, an audio approach or a verbal approach, and use speech reading and residual hearing. And if you use sign language, they will have delays and you won't be able to communicate with your child. And that's an ongoing message that they're inundated with, hearing parents of deaf children. And over 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So that's the case largely in our society. So that lack of communication access, continues from the time they're infants, and maybe there are well-meaning parents who are very invested and love their children, and yet oftentimes there are big communication gaps between children and parents. And that lends itself then when they get to school, where deaf children go to public schools, mainstream programs where they may be isolated or have a few other peers, but there isn't a lot of discussion about, boundaries, about, their bodies and their rights, about who to go to if they feel like their boundaries are violated and that type of thing. There's a real lack there. So deaf children really are at high risk for sexual abuse. In February, this most recent February, I was invited to attend a roundtable discussion. It was hosted by the Vera Institute of Justice in Seattle, Washington. And at the roundtable, we got together for the purpose of sister agencies. We actually have about 15, somewhere around 15 deaf domestic violence and sexual assault agencies throughout the United States. There should be more, and we're hoping that more will come on board, but we were invited to attend this roundtable discussion about sexual abuse of deaf children. And during that discussion, the Vera Institute of Justice facilitator asked our sister agencies, we have no data on the prevalence of sexual abuse in deaf children, but if you had to guess or estimate based upon just what you see at your work with clients, through friends and family, through your network in the community, what would be your estimate in terms of percentage of how many deaf children experience some form of sexual assault. And all of us, I believe that there were about 12 of us at the table at that time, all of us estimated anywhere from 85 to 95% of deaf children experience some form of sexual abuse. And it really is an epidemic in the deaf community, but many deaf people are not willing to talk about it. And it comes up maybe later on in life when they're adults, when they experience a different type of victimization. They then may contact Dove for services, for example, for domestic violence, let's say. They'll contact us, and they often then will disclose, in fact, something that happened to them when they were a kid. And they'll say, it happened at school, or this happened in my with your family member. And hearing, or people in general, adults, tend to exploit deaf children because they know that they don't have access to communication, that deaf children are not taught these boundaries, that they're not taught their rights, that they don't know how to ask for help easily. So they're easily exploited. And it's very true. It bears itself out. It's just a valid reality. It's a large problem in the deaf community. So it's just something to be aware of as service providers. I'd like to talk about some of the barriers that lead to re-victimization of deaf survivors. I could go on and on. I mean, I could go on all day about this. I won't, obviously. I just wanted to share a few of the common situations as examples that arise. As you can see, you see this acronym LE. I use that to stand for law enforcement. And there may be some people in the audience right now that work for law enforcement departments, and I am not intending to, of course, criticize or to take some stance that I'm upset with law enforcement or any particular agency. But the fact is that there are some common barriers that have arisen historically and still do to this day. So when deaf people find themselves in a situation involving sexual assault and law enforcement is called for whatever reason, whoever decides to call law enforcement, they become involved. Oftentimes law enforcement will dedicate all of their focus to the speaking person, to the hearing person. And again, that goes back to human nature. I think, the law enforcement personnel thinking, who can I understand in the situation? They come into a situation, they see people's hands flying, they see people upset, and they don't understand what's going on. So they seek out if there's anyone there in the room that I can communicate with, and they go immediately to that person. That's certainly understandable. It makes sense in terms of human nature. But oftentimes, in terms of a deaf-hearing partnership, oftentimes the hearing person is the rapist or the abuser, and of course, they will take advantage of their ability to speak and take control of the situation, tell a law enforcement officer, oh, there was just a misunderstanding, or, this is part of deaf culture, we do these things in deaf culture, and make excuses for and explain away what actually occurred. And that can be an enormous frustration for a deaf victim. Another example is when law enforcement sees a deaf person very upset, crying, hysterical, and they're signing very large and hysterically because ASL does have grammatical components, and when a person is, has a lot of affect and upset or they're angry, they'll sign more animatedly with a lot of facial expression, which facial expression actually conveys grammar in the language. They might be, their shoulders might be hunched or their eyebrows might be pursed, or, they'll get into the law enforcement person's face, and that typically can be perceived or interpreted as threatening behavior. That person is in fact the one who is the abuser because of their exaggerated facial expression. And in fact, they're just expressing themselves. And that oftentimes becomes another problem for survivors, obviously. So, and basically, if they see a law enforcement agency or another person involved, it could be that the deaf or hard of hearing person may be speaking on their own. That may be the case. But the deaf person typically will come up and tap the law enforcement officer on the shoulder, wanting them to look at them because they're paying all their attention to the speaking person, and that can be perceived as threatening as well. But deaf people, in terms of mannerisms or common sense or knowledge of the typical rules or protocol in terms of not touching a law enforcement officer, they may not be aware of that, and they want to get the law enforcement officer's attention through body language so that they can tell their side of the story. And oftentimes, in these situations, they're happening late at night, of course, usually, and they're often happening in rural areas, or even in the metropolitan area where maybe the law enforcement officer has never had any experience with a deaf or hard of hearing person before. The law enforcement will say, we don't need an interpreter, we can just write notes back and forth about this. And if it seems like the victim is able to speak, they'll just say, well, use your voice and just tell me what happened, right? And maybe the victim can't speak, but they would prefer ASL as their natural and native language. And I'm someone who, for me, I took years of speech therapy classes. I can thank my parents for that I can speak if I choose to, if I have to in a given setting. But I choose not to because if I speak, oftentimes, automatically hearing people, be it service providers or anyone else, will then assume that I can understand them when they respond to me, when in fact that's not the case. And that can create a lot of difficulty for my understanding. And spoken English, I believe only 30 to 35% of spoken English is discernible upon the lips through speech reading. And so the rest becomes guesswork. And it can be very exhausting to guess based on context what the person is saying and results in a great deal of misunderstanding. So it's not a reliable form of communication to ask the deaf person to speech read. And that can be a challenge when it comes to victims choosing to speak if the law enforcement officer asks them to, or forces them to write written English. Remember, as I said before, it may not be their first or primary language, and they may be very not adept at writing English, and they'll just give up and say, I guess I won't tell my story, or they won't give the details that they want to, that they would through American Sign Language, because they don't know how to express themselves in English. They'd rather have an ASL interpreter on site, but the law enforcement agency will say, oh, it's too late at night, it'll take so long to get one here, and so that becomes a real frustration and challenge, which can lead to, again, re-victimization. And speaking of law enforcement and hospital personnel, oftentimes they'll say, oh, well, we have a family member or friend who's right here in the room or in the house. And they'll say, well, do you mind just coming to interpret for us, for law enforcement or hospital personnel? And that's actually a very big no-no for many reasons. One being that if you ask a family member or a friend to interpret, then neutrality is completely dismissed. And there was one situation as an example. There was a case in which, this was some time ago, years and years ago, before I actually was working for Dove, where another advocate was working on a case in which a woman had been suffering for years and years with domestic violence perpetrated by her husband. And there was a sexual assault that occurred one night between the husband. The husband raped the wife, and police became involved. And it so happened that the woman's daughter was home from college. And she is what we refer to as a CODA, a child of deaf adults, which means she's hearing, but she grew up with a deaf parent. And so she happened to be home from school, and the officer saw that she was here. She was 17 or 18 and said, hey, could you come and interpret and tell me what your mom is signing to me? What happened? And the mom completely shut down. Because remember, the police officer, can be intimidating to anyone. And so deaf people may not feel comfortable saying, I don't want to use my daughter to interpret, when in the back of their mind, they're just thinking, well, I guess, they want to use my daughter to interpret, but, her story became very obscured. She didn't give the details of what actually took place through her daughter. And then Deb became involved later on in the process and realized that there was no qualified interpreter for the questioning by the law enforcement agency. And so they asked for a legally qualified interpreter to be brought in for an interview. And again, this was, very traumatic for the survivor to then have to come to the police station and explain all over again what took place. However, in this case, with the legally qualified interpreter there, with her daughter out of the picture, she went through the details of what took place that evening, and it ended up that the survivor was charged with false reporting because her story the second time at the police station didn't match the story that was given the first time through the daughter interpreting. And so that is an extreme example, but it does take place. It still takes place to this day that if family members are used to interpret and the survivor doesn't feel comfortable expressing in detail what happened through their mother or through their daughter or through a brother, let's say, and so they'll just shut down, and it can be very difficult. It's also difficult for the family member asked to, have awareness of what happened, what my mom or their child went through emotionally. That's not their job, obviously, to don the mask of neutrality. They're a family member or a friend, and they want to be there to support and take care of their family member or whoever is the survivor. So it's important to not use family members or friends to interpret. The other reason being that they may not be fluent in American Sign Language. They may, maybe to a hearing person's perception, the interaction between the family member and the interpreter may look like, there's signing taking place, but in fact, it's often the case that hearing family members or friends may know what we call home signs, very, very basic gestures, or even codes that aren't really grammatically accurate American Sign Language. And some survivors may sign very, very rapidly and very, very animatedly about what happened, and the family member may just condense all of that down into just a summary, what they guess that the person is saying, or what the detective or law enforcement agency wants to hear, and it becomes inaccurate information that's relayed through that family member or friend. The final reason here is that sometimes we'll see agencies, a variety of different types of agencies, contract with what we call foreign language translation agencies. Those agencies are wonderful. They're a great resource, and they provide translation services for a number of different spoken languages. They will add on occasionally ASL as one of their specialty, services that they can provide ASL interpreting. The problem, however, is that ASL is so specialized that the qualification process, the screening process to become an ASL interpreter is so distinct from those who provide foreign language interpreting. And so it's hard for an agency who provides foreign language translation to know the appropriate way to screen and hire these people brought on. And oftentimes the foreign language translation agencies will go with the cheapest people that they can find, but they don't hire qualified sign language interpreters. And that then is to the detriment of whoever they're calling to the situation, because any service provider with the deaf survivor, both of them are losing out in the end because they're not getting full access to communication from each other. When it comes to the example of the hospital, finally, we're seeing more and more in Colorado recently where hospitals are choosing to use a technology that we refer to as VRI. And I haven't mentioned that yet in the presentation. It stands for Video Remote Interpreting. And as you recall, I spoke about Video Relay Service, or VRS, a few slides ago. It's a similar concept. So for example, if it's a SANE exam, let's say the SANE unit, they may have a mobile cart. And on the cart, they have a laptop, let's say, with maybe different technologies that are installed. And they'll wheel that cart with the VRI equipment on it. And it functions similar to VRS, how I explained that before. The interpreter will appear on a screen that the deaf person can see, and they're able to hear what's going on in the room and sign to the deaf person what the hearing people are saying in the room for, let's say, the SANE exam. However, the problems are oftentimes hospital staff have no idea how to use VRI. They'll say, oh, well, we've got this technology and we're going to use it, and they'll bring that into the room and they'll say, okay, you just take care of it, and they don't know how to actually use it to the best advantage. And so that is, again, re-victimization for the person who has to help figure out how to use the technology, how to connect with the interpreter, which is the large frustration in that crisis. And VRI is based upon high-speed internet and the presence of high-speed internet at that location. And oftentimes we see it's the case over and over that high-speed internet is not always reliable. The picture, the screen may become very grainy or choppy, and the signing ends up looking very compromised. And so a lot of things are missed and a lot of things don't make sense. It can be very difficult for the interpreter and frustrating for the deaf survivor who's there in the hospital. Not to mention, finally, if there's someone on a screen, it feels very different than having someone, a live person on site that you can see. ASL is a 3D language, and it's always better to have a conversation in person than through a screen that's 2D. And so VRI really is not the best or ideal option, especially when it comes to someone who's gone through crisis, who's going through trauma. Bringing on on-site interpreter is certainly a better solution. We've seen hospitals say, well, we have this, and so that's what we're able to provide. We have this VRI equipment. And so the deaf person feels like they can't say anything. They're providing something, which they're saying is better than nothing. But in fact, I want a live on-site interpreter here to interpret in this situation. So it creates a lot of difficulty. Something to keep in mind in terms of the laws that apply to deaf and hard of hearing survivors and deafblind survivors. There are two, in fact. The ADA you may be familiar with. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the other law here in Colorado is the revised statute. You see the number there, 1390-201 through 210. And really, essentially, both are talking about accommodation to communication needs for deaf and hard of hearing people. The Americans with Disabilities Act says that Title II and III, for the purposes of any state or local government agency or public entity and nonprofit agencies are included, are responsible to provide reasonable accommodations to deaf and hard of hearing people, or really any person with a disability. So for example, I mean, you may be familiar with, people, wheelchair ramps, that people are needing to access a facility, let's say. They're needing to access that through, using their wheelchair. Deaf people, however, when it comes to the ADA, need a qualified sign language interpreter to suit their accommodation needs. And how the ADA defines a qualified interpreter is the interpreter who is able to interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using any necessary specialized vocabulary. And if you think back to using a family member or a friend brought in to interpret, someone who grew up, say, with a deaf friend, bringing them in to interpret in this situation, of course, that does not suit the ADA definition of qualified interpreter. Effective, accurate, and partial, of course, wouldn't apply to that person. And so that's something to really keep in mind. The Colorado statute also is more, even restricts in terms of legal situations. So if a deaf victim, let's say, has to be interviewed by a detective or needs to meet with the district attorney about their particular case, in those situations, those have a great deal of legal complexity. In Colorado, we have a legal certification process for interpreters. So if I am a generally certified sign language interpreter and I've taken the necessary exams and received my national certification, I'll have a blue card that proves that. I then would pursue additional hours, additional training, supervised hours, where a mentor interpreter was watching me interpret in the courtroom to become legally qualified. Because of course these situations are more complex in terms of the terminology used. The situation is entirely different than journal situations. So if you have a deaf client, it's important then that when they're involved in a legal situation or a legal scenario to ask for a legally qualified sign language interpreter as opposed to a generally certified interpreter. I've talked about some of these already, but I think I'm going to repeat them because they bear repeating, and I don't, we may often forget or neglect to recall these if I don't repeat them. There is a difference between a signer and a qualified interpreter, as you can see. A signer is someone who knows some sign language, right? Their skill level could be varied. They haven't gone through any type of formal training. They do not possess national certification, and they don't comply with any code of ethics. Meaning, in terms of confidentiality, that's out the window. They could tell anybody they like about anything that took place in that situation that they just quote-unquote interpreted. And that is a big issue. Family members and friends who are brought in to interpret. In addition to what I just mentioned earlier about a signer, they also have an emotional attachment to the victim or to the survivor, of course. They need to act as a support person, a family or friend in that role, versus having the burden or the duty on them to interpret impartially as well. Whereas a qualified interpreter, again, they interpret effective, accurately, and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using any specialized terminology or vocabulary. And a lot of people out there, now that YouTube has taken off and that's so popular, there are a lot of ASL, music videos or ASL students who are finding stories on YouTube. And people are becoming more aware of ASL as a language and how beautiful it is and how cool it is. And they think, oh, that'd be really easy to learn ASL, right? I could become an interpreter. When in fact, that's not the case. It's very difficult. ASL is a complex language, just like any other spoken languages. It doesn't take just 2 months to learn. Of course, it takes years and years, and an immersion into the deaf community to become truly fluent in ASL. And so people who are qualified interpreters have taken coursework. They've taken an exam, both written and performance exams, to become certified at a national level to interpret. And so, as a consumer of interpreting services, because the interpreter is not just there to meet the deaf person's needs, they're there to meet the service provider's needs, the hearing service provider's needs as well, right? Because you need to understand what the deaf person is saying. So you have a right at any time to ask the interpreter, may I please see your certification? I'd like to see your national certification. And then they can present their national certification. You see on the bottom a blue card there, which denotes what they should have on their body at all times to be able to present to validate that they are certified. If they say, oh, well, I'm not certified yet, then they shouldn't be there. And you can contact their agency and, lodge a complaint. Why did you send this uncertified interpreter? this is actually a serious situation, and it warrants, we both deserve a certified interpreter in this situation. And another thing that I think is critical in terms of the quality of interpretation is the code of professional conduct that interpreters abide by, or we refer to it as the code of ethics, specifically when it comes to confidentiality. Interpreters and their, they have confidential information. They have privileged communication that they're relaying. So that neutrality and confidentiality is critical. So when you connect to a survivor to provide them resources, maybe it's just on the phone, maybe you never work with them in person, but you want to make sure that you think about, say, okay, if I refer this deaf person to, let's say, mental health services, for example, now you have to think, will that agency in my town be familiar with how to work with deaf people? Will they be able to provide communication access? Will that become a challenge? So how will I make this referral effective for this deaf person? And oftentimes, Dove advocates, when we make a referral, we don't just pass along the phone number and say, oh, well, go ahead and call this agency and, ask to make an appointment. We kind of, walk with them through the process, through that referral process, which means we may call that agency and say, hey, are you prepared to provide a qualified certified interpreter if I connect a deaf client to your services? And if not, how can we help support you to make sure that you become more aware of what you need to provide for this deaf client, the deaf person who has this need? And so it's sad to say, but you almost have to think ahead about what the potential barriers may be if I refer that person to a neighboring agency. And if I place the referral, and if the referral fails or falls through, where can that victim or survivor seek support? Can they call you again? Or can you refer them to Dove? Or, what's your backup plan for appropriate advocacy for a deaf person? It's important to keep that in mind and not just, say, oh, here's my automatic reply. I refer everyone with your issue to this agency, and then I'm done. In fact, that may not be the case in this situation. So in terms of how you as service providers can reduce re-victimization, there are a number of thoughts I have. I strongly encourage agencies to consider setting up a communication access policy, establishing that in advance, which means it needs to have different components to that policy. Does your agency have something in the budget for communication accommodations, a line item? Are you ready to provide services to a deaf survivor who comes in and says, I need to speak with someone, one of your advocates in person, but I use ASL as my first language, and I don't want to write notes back and forth in my second language. And that's their right to use their first language. So what do? Do you have a line item in your budget for ASL interpreting services? Is it in, could it be a grant request? Could it be, some of you I know who are on this webinar may not have direct involvement with grant writing, and that's understandable. But you can, of course, talk to whoever does in your agency and say, hey, we have never really asked our funders for a specific line item, interpreter line item for communication access in the budget. And if not, we should, because a lot of funders do look at that and are impressed if your agency is making that request proactively, under an ADA-related item, let's say. Interpreters might be what you're requesting. And if, you do provide interpreters readily, interpreters are not inexpensive, and most interpreters in Colorado may, the cost varies widely if you use a referral agency versus an individual freelance interpreter, but most may run around $60 per hour, and that doesn't include their travel time, which may be added on, their mileage occasionally, and so it can become expensive, but most interpreters also require a 2-hour minimum. Even if you meet with a deaf person with an interpreter there for just an hour, they still will charge a 2-hour minimum as an industry standard. And again, it's not inexpensive because it's very difficult work. And they really are qualified to a great degree to meet all of those needs. And they went through an arduous process, so they need to be compensated for that. So keep that budget line item in mind. It's also important to think about protocol. For example, if a deaf person were to come into the receptionist at an agency and say, I need an interpreter, or I need some type of accommodation. What's the protocol then? Does the receptionist have the right to call and request an interpreter, or does the receptionist need to call their supervisor, or who is ultimately responsible to provide the accommodation based on that request, and be prepared and not just wait until the deaf person comes in and everyone freaks out and says, I don't know who does this, or do you have the name of an agency, or do you have the list of interpreters? And be prepared in advance in terms of being proactive instead of reactive. And again, start reaching out to ASL interpreter agencies in advance, not foreign language interpreting agencies, because, and I actually do have a link at the end that you can click on and get a list of all the ASL interpreting agencies in the state of Colorado. And you can pick which one is located most closely to where you are. But keep in mind, of course, that not any interpreting agency is in the mountains at this point. And that can be a real challenge for rural service providers. Absolutely. However, if you can, arrange to meet with the deaf person or survivor, even, in a couple days from now, you then can contact one of the agencies that's in the Front Range and say, can you send an interpreter to wherever it may be, wherever you are, let's say Breckenridge, for example. You certainly can, with some advance notice, get an interpreter on site. And that's not ideal, of course, but you want to be able to provide immediate services, right? However, there still are limited resources, and that's the reality of that we have to keep in mind. But do begin proactively contacting agencies and setting up contracts, perhaps, with one or two or multiple interpreting agencies so that you're prepared in terms of protocol. You have the phone numbers readily available on the receptionist desk, and you know who does the contacting for those interpreting agencies to be provided. Also, in your communication access policy, it's important to consider setting up some sort of MOU or some sort of agreement with your agency and DOVE. So we do provide direct advocacy services, and oftentimes we find it very effective if we partner with another hearing service agency provider, like a victim advocate who is with law enforcement, or a shelter staff member, or any number of personnel who we can partner with, because that service provider, as a hearing service provider, you're familiar with your area, your protocol, what survivors need to do in your given area. As a deaf advocate, I am there as, I provide that cultural mediation to the survivor. I repeat and explain concepts to the survivor in ASL directly. And so really, it's helpful for everyone involved if DOVE is involved in a case, if the survivor would like that to be the case, if they agree to that. Also, continuing, training for staff, not just think, oh, well, we took this webinar one time and now we've got it in the bag. I know everything there is that I need to know about deaf people. In fact, you can always ask DOVE. You can contact us and ask us to come to your agency and provide additional ongoing training. We'd be happy to do that. And again, partnering with DOVE or other deaf service providers. As you can see, that long acronym, DDBDDHH, really, that acronym means deaf, deaf-blind, deaf with disabilities, and hard of hearing. It just is an inclusive acronym. It's an acronym inclusive of everyone in our community. There are a number of agencies out there, like MHCD, Mental Health Center of Denver. They have deaf counseling services, and they have 2 therapists there who are sign fluent. And they are a place that we often partner with and refer our clients to for ongoing additional services. So that's one example of a partner agency. I think it comes down to also self-talk. Oh, actually, I jumped a bit. So being willing to be flexible about your agency's rules. And what I mean by that is, just as one example, in terms of domestic violence shelters, you may have, work for a domestic violence shelter, and you have a client who contacts you who just recently experienced sexual assault, let's say, in a domestic violence relationship, and they need to escape and they need to get out, and so you have your protocol, and the shelter staff will say, oh, okay, you need to come in to do your screening or your intake questions because I'm not comfortable speaking through the video relay service interpreter to do that. I'd rather speak to you directly to do that. And the deaf survivor will say, okay, well, you're treating me differently than hearing survivors because if I was hearing and I called, you'd be able to do a phone screening with me. But because I'm, speaking, quote unquote, through an interpreter, you won't. So I have to come all the way to the shelter office to do the screening and intake. which is a real burden on me. That's just one example of how to be flexible about your general agency rules and policies. I think it's important, again, when it comes to self-talk, to never assume anything. For example, if you see someone who appears to be culturally deaf because they're signing, that's fine. But then you call an interpreter, and the deaf person says, I never asked for an interpreter. I'm fine writing with you, writing notes. I can write English well. You just want to make sure that you ask the deaf person, what's the best way for us to communicate? You never know. Maybe their answer may be different than what you would expect. And also consider the intersections of identity. So I, am speaking in this webinar as, I am a white, deaf woman, cisgendered woman, but people who are deaf often have other multiple identities in terms of their religious belief, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender identity. That intersectionality also plays a part in their experience as a survivor. So it's important to be mindful of, okay, I'm looking at this client not just as a deaf person, but in fact they may have other intersecting identities. So it's important to keep that in mind. And to look at the entire person as a whole. And to do more than just the bare minimum. Right? Deaf people oftentimes experience, service providers who will say, well, I just kind of want to get rid of you. It's a hot potato kind of thing. Why don't you go over here to somebody else? And it feels very intimidating and despairing. And so give them your full attention and remember to ask questions and to listen then to their responses. So I know that we are running out of time. I do want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. But before I do that, I'd like to summarize what Dove is for those of you who may not know. We're a nonprofit agency, and we've been around since 2000. And, oh, I forgot to change this. We actually now have 5 deaf staff members currently. We just actually hired 2 part-time staff members. So we've grown a lot over the past year. And we have 4 out of 5 of our staff members provide direct advocacy services. And we are dedicated to serving victims of both domestic violence and sexual assault in the Colorado deaf community, whether they specifically identify as deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing, or even a CODA, a child of deaf adults. Sometimes children of deaf adults feel more comfortable working with a deaf advocate, even though they are hearing, compared to a hearing service provider, and we're happy to work with children of deaf adults, or CODAs as well. And all of our services are free, regardless of age, race, gender, identity, sexual orientation, or religion, religious affiliation, or nationality, and income level. One really important thing to keep in mind is that we are not an interpreting service provider. If you contact us, we're happy to refer you to an interpreting agency or service provider, but we can't coordinate or pay for interpreting services. And sometimes we can in an emergency situation if someone's unprepared to provide interpreting. That's a last resort, however, because our budget is obviously very limited too. We're a nonprofit agency and we don't have interpreters on staff. All of our staff members are deaf. So if you ask us to be there, we'll be there as a deaf advocate in that role, but not in an interpreting role. And Dove does not have a shelter. We do collaborate with a number of shelters throughout the state. We provide ongoing training to those shelters. We have what's called an ADA kit, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act kit, which has a variety of different devices and technologies included that we provide on loan to shelters if a deaf person is residing there. For instance, a strobe light flashing doorbell, a door knocker. If somebody knocks on the survivor's door in the shelter, they can't hear that, but a strobe light will flash inside of the room and the deaf person will know that someone wants to get their attention and come into the room, that type of thing. We can provide those on loan to shelters if needed. Dove's role, essentially, with hearing service providers is to advocate for communication access, to provide emotional support for the deaf survivor as a member of their own cultural community, as a peer. We provide resources for service providers. We are here to support you, and we want to help you be successful advocates as well. So we can be involved in any or every step of the way. It could be during the crisis, it could be during a hearing or trial, it could be during a law enforcement interview. We can support someone in jail. We've gone to prison or jails, and we can be there for someone, a deaf person. a shelter, let's say, a shelter intake process, or connecting you as a service provider with another resource is a role that we can play in the deaf community. And the last slide that I have here, and this is a list of different resources. I also have a tip sheet, if I can find that. I'm not seeing the mouse. Let's see. I'll send out the tip sheet after the presentation is over, and that tip sheet has even more information and resources. So please feel free to print that out and distribute it and to share it with your coworkers and your networks, anyone who may need that. There are a lot of resources in there. You see Dove's contact information. The Colorado Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing is a state governmental agency, and they coordinate legally qualified interpreters in districts and county court. They also have a list of ASL interpreting agencies in Colorado, and all of that information is here for you. And if you would like to know if an interpreter that you just worked with is in fact certified, and you forgot to ask for their blue card, as I mentioned, you can look their name up through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID, online. And if you have questions about the ADA specifically, you can contact the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. So now I'll open it up for questions. The floor is yours if anyone has any questions. I also have two final poll questions I should mention, but I think I'll hold on those and let you ask any questions that you may have first. I'll give you a few minutes to compose those questions. I'm happy if there are, and no question is a dumb question. No question, it's offensive to me. I won't take any offense. Ask me anything that you'd like to. The mouse doesn't seem to be displaying. I'm wondering if you can. Okay, found it. I'm looking at the poll. Still not cooperating. So while we're waiting for people to think of any questions they may have, let me go ahead and display the next poll questions. So when you receive a VRS, again, a video relay service call, it's best to speak directly to the interpreter? Is the question? Yes? Or true or false, I guess. Go ahead and answer that question. Okay. So I'm just going to take the opportunity to make sure that you do know the right answer. So when you receive a video relay service call, it's best to speak directly to the deaf person, because the deaf person is the person placing the call. You should not say things like, oh, will you tell her that she can go to the front desk and fill out an application? That's, in fact, not what you should say. In fact, what you should say is, you can come in to our front desk and you can fill out an application, right? So that's how that would be the best answer. That's the best response to a VRS caller. The next question here is, Dove's office is based in Denver, but our services are provided statewide. True or false? And so, please go ahead and reply. All right, you all got that one right. Yes, our office is located in the Metro Denver area. Most of our training and direct advocacy services we do actually provide on the Front Range. However, there have been times, here and there where we've driven to the mountains or to southern or northern Colorado to provide trainings or direct advocacy services if needed. And we can communicate with you if you feel like, it's not in the budget, if the budget doesn't allow you to bring us that far, we can collaborate with you and make some sort of advocacy services work from a distance. Sometimes survivors, say in Grand Junction, are not always really able to get that far, but we do use technology, like I mentioned, video phones, to communicate with the deaf survivor directly, and we would work with the hearing service provider to make sure that they know what the best tips are, the best resources in terms of working with their deaf survivor. So we do have a few minutes left. If anyone would like to ask any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. I do really appreciate you all participating in the webinar. Oh, we do have a question. Okay. Has anyone been doing research on the prevalence of sexual assault in the deaf community? And I know you said that there aren't really any statistics. I think the two colleges that I mentioned earlier, Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., and the National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester, they always have very small studies that are taking place. Some hospitals, like I know in Rochester, I think the University Hospital in Rochester, I'm blanking on the name of the facility, is doing more and more research. Gallaudet University has its own research arm, its own research institute that's recognizing the need for more data collection and statistics. So hopefully there will be more research taking place in the future. In terms of current research and current ongoing research when it comes to sexual abuse in the deaf community, I'm not certain. There needs to be more, certainly. Another question that came in, Christella asked, is there any equivalent to Dove in California or in the Bay Area? Yes, there is. We have a sister agency called Deaf Hope, and they are actually, I believe, in the Bay Area, in California. They provide very similar types of services as Dove does, and they have deaf advocates on staff. I believe their website is www.deaf-hope.org. Or, you can just Google Deaf Hope, and you should find their organization, their contact information. So thank you for your question. That's a good one. And off the top of my head, our deaf sister agencies throughout the country, we have one in New York. We had one recently established in Massachusetts, California, Washington State, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, Texas, of course, Colorado, Utah. I'm trying to think of others. Oh, Texas, I just mentioned. So there are more, but we really do need more deaf specialized victim advocacy services throughout the United States. There's something called Justice for Deaf Victims National Coalition, and that is a collective group of different members of deaf sister agencies that do domestic violence and sexual assault service provision, and that is more of a long-term goal where we want a one-stop center where hearing providers who don't know how to provide deaf specialized services can get in touch with one sort of central place. If there's a place in Montana that needs help, getting sort of a clearinghouse. But that's our long-term goal. Hopefully we'll see that come to fruition in the next few years. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your attention. I hope that this was beneficial information to everyone. And do feel free to reach out to Dove at any point in time with questions or if you need support. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. We really appreciate it. This was such an informative webinar. For all of our attendees, please just a reminder to fill out our survey at the end, and we will be sending you an email with the PowerPoints and the handout, so you will receive that. But please, please, please fill out our survey so we get to know what other topics you're interested on. Also, I would like to invite all of you for our next webinar, which will be December 9th at the same time. We will be sending also information about the title and the little description of the webinar, but I can tell you a little bit. It will be related to services provided to the Latino community. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.